For 4 days, the Ukrainian army has been targeting Russian assets in and around Crimea. Operations continued this morning with explosions reported at the largest military base in Crimea. Yesterday, powerful explosions occurred in Sebastopol and Theodosia. Russian officials seemed puzzled. Explosions roared in occupied Crimea on Thursday, July 20th, heard in Sebastopol and Theodosia. Residents of occupied Sebastopol reported hearing explosions in the Gagarin area, either by Komyakova Bay or by Kazanka Bay. Russian authorities did not comment on the new eruptions on the occupied peninsula. Also, a loud eruption occurred in the Theodosia region. Later, the Crimean telegraph channels, referring to the occupying authorities, reported that armed exercises were allegedly held in the city on the night of July 20th. Explosions were heard in the northwest of occupied Crimea, near the village of Razdolnoye, according to media reports. The occupiers announced a drone strike that allegedly damaged 4 administrative buildings. Additionally, explosions were heard in the area of the Starokadomsky test site in eastern Crimea. Information about the hits was published on the internet, and residents reported that the ammunition exploded as a result of the fire. One of the largest military bases of the Russian Federation in Crimea was destroyed, leading to a mass evacuation. The Tavrida highway was closed in the eastern part of Crimea. In the Kirov region near the village of Krynychky, the largest ammunition depot is burning and exploding. Since the early morning in occupied Crimea, ammunition has been exploding in the warehouse at the training ground in the Kirovsky region. Russian telegram channels reported that the first explosions were heard around 4:30 in the morning, and artillery fire continued until now. Sergei Aksyonov said that they closed the illegally built Tavrida highway in Crimea and they want to evacuate more than 2,000 people from 4 settlements. The Crimean Wind Telegraph Channel writes that at the base where the ammunition exploded, there were dead and many wounded. Explosions were heard even in Theodosia, 20 kilometers from the training ground. There were 3 rocket or drone attacks hitting a warehouse at a training ground near the town of Starokrym in eastern Crimea. After that, the Russian army crossed the start of Krymsky shooting range, closing the roads and all exits in the direction of Tavrida. The distance from this shooting range to the nearest point of the front line is at least 230 kilometers. Sergei Aksyonov, the head of the occupation administration in Russia's annexed Crimea, confirmed the information regarding the fire that broke out in an ammunition depot in the east of the peninsula. Prior to these operations, Ukraine had carried out attacks in Crimea that were meant to terrify President Vladimir Putin and his army. Explosions occurred on the Crimean Bridge at the beginning of the week. The head of the Crimean occupation regime, Sergei Aksyonov, announced that traffic on the Kerch Bridge leading to Crimea was stopped due to the emergency. The incident occurred near the 145th bridge post near the Krasnodar region of the Russian Federation. The explosion occurred without warning of air strikes by the invaders. Eyewitnesses saw smoke rising from the bridge and heard a strong explosion. One of the bridge spans collapsed, and the other was damaged and fell off the column after at least one hit. This is a special operation of the Ukrainian Security Service and the Ukrainian Navy. Russian propagandists released a video allegedly showing the moment of the attack on the Crimean Bridge. The explosion is clearly visible in the video. Ukrainian Air Force Command spokesman Yuri Ignat said he was happy about the explosions on the Crimean Bridge today because thanks to this explosion, there is no water, no bridges, no forests. This puts the invading Russians in a difficult situation. Ignatieff is happy about that. He added that this is good news for Ukrainians. We must be patient and hate the invader more, Ignat said. Artem Dikter, a representative of the Ukrainian Security Service, stated that he will definitely reveal all the details about the organization of the Big Bang after the Ukrainian victory regarding the explosions that took place on the Crimean Bridge today. In the meantime, Dikter continued, "We are once again watching with interest the failure of one of the symbols of the Putin regime to withstand the military burden." The office noted that the head of the Security Service of Ukraine, Vasyl Malyuk, in one of the interviews, said that the norms of international law, the analysis of the operational situation, and the customs of war make it possible to cut off the enemy's logistics routes. Also, hours before the attack on the Crimean Bridge, powerful explosions shook Crimea's Cape Khersonis, Sebastopol Bay, and Balaklava. Ukraine carried out the most intense drone attack of the last 2 months on the Sebastopol port, which was annexed by Crimea in the early hours of July 16. A surface kamikaze naval drone attacked the city. This drone caused havoc, and two more drones separately bombed the city, which is the headquarters of President Putin's Black Sea Fleet. So, what is the background of the attack, and with what weapons could the attack be made? Today, the Crimean Bridge is one of the military equipment transportation corridors for the Russian army. Ukrainian fighters are well aware of the importance of this. Military expert Roman Svetin, retired colonel of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, commented on the attack on the Crimean Bridge, which resulted in the collapse of a part of it. Most likely, Ukrainian troops are indeed behind the explosions on the Crimean Bridge, Svetin noted. According to this military expert, the explosion took place before the invaders gave an airstrike alert. In this context, he did not rule out that the explosion was not connected with an airstrike. According to him, drones could attack the Crimean Bridge. The expert thinks that this attack was the joint work of the Ukrainian Security Service and the Navy. In this tandem, they carried out several attacks with surface drones in Sebastopol Bay. Ukrainian fighters have glider planes that can carry 100 to 200 kilograms of explosives, and there were probably two as they were launched in pairs. In general, looking at the incident this morning, there are no holes in the Crimean Bridge that could have come from, for example, a missile. Any airborne defeat tool has no effect in this case. No missile may have been used. On the other hand, since we know the laws of physics, it is obvious that the explosion was not caused by air. If there was no impact from an airborne object and there was no explosion above the surface damaging the bridge, then it is likely that something damaged the bridge from below. A gas cylinder can explode under a bridge or another object. The damage to the bridge is quite serious, and its use in the near future is doubtful. It turned out that only one line will be used in the reverse format, which complicates the flow of cargo. But the thing is, the Russian army mainly uses railways for cargo transportation, and the railway on the Crimean Bridge is not yet fully operational. Ukraine's counterattack operations continue with fierce clashes in the eastern and southern axes. At the center of these conflicts is the idea of the re-emancipation of the Russian-occupied territories. Each success, especially on the southern front, brings Ukraine one step closer to the Black Sea Peninsula. If the Ukrainian armed forces completely clear the south of Ukraine from Russian invaders, they will have a chance to focus more comfortably on Crimea. For these reasons, the Kiev troops are attacking the critical formations of the Russian troops on the southern axis. The last example of this situation occurred yesterday. Let's dive into the details of the attack without wasting any time and take a closer look at the latest situation on the front lines. Explosions occurred at the Russian base north of the occupied Melitopol in the Zaporizhia region. Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorov reported this on Telegram. According to preliminary information, the explosion occurred in a hangar in the village of Zerechny, which was converted into a Russian base. It was reported that the ammunition at the Russian base exploded with the violence of the explosion. The explosion of ammunition made the explosion more terrifying. This latest explosion dealt another powerful blow to the Russian army, which had been short of ammunition for a long time. Officials stated that work is continuing to clarify the details of the attack. Russian troops temporarily formed a military convoy at hospitals in occupied Melitopol. In addition, this attack was not the first attack on Melitopol, nor would it be the last. If you remember, on June 28, a total of 5 explosions were reported in Melitopol in just 24 hours. Such attacks have now become routine for residents. Earlier this month, Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorov announced that a loud explosion occurred in the Russian-occupied town of Melitopol. The explosions were caused by an attack on a Russian base near a farm in the Ukrainian village of Semenivka. This farm was located in a large area that the Russian forces had previously captured and used as a headquarters. The Ukrainians knew that the Russians made military supplies from this headquarters to the city of Tokmak, Berdyansk, and the Zaporizhia front lines. Considering that the Ukrainians control the Kherson to Dnipro direction, a significant part of the front lines in Zaporizhia, Melitopol is a suitable city to support the clashes on the southern front lines of Russia. But after the Ukrainian forces targeted the Russian military base in Melitopol with the latest attacks, all of Moscow's plans were turned upside down. Russian leader Vladimir Putin expected a victory from the southern trenches. However, the destruction of the Russian headquarters in Melitopol by the Ukrainian forces also demoralized the Russian soldiers in this region. On the other hand, in June, not far from the occupied Melitopol region, an explosion occurred on a railway used by the Russians to transport personnel and military equipment. Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorov shared the details of the explosion on his social media platform. Fedorov stated that the railway tracks near the village of Dolinska in Yakimivka district were out of use with a loud explosion. Fedorov underlined that the Russians used the railway to transport personnel and military equipment to the front and that this is a great shortcoming for the Russians. At the same time, this railway was the most important supply line between the Kerch-Bosphorus Bridge and the Russian mainland and Crimea, which was annexed in 2014. It seems that the attacks of Ukrainian forces on Melitopol are increasing day by day. The purpose of these attacks is to clear the routes to Crimea from Russians and to corner the Russian troops. So what's been happening on the other front lines lately? Ukrainian forces reportedly launched a missile attack on the Crimean bridge in occupied Crimea. Russian sources reported that the Ukrainian Air Force once again attempted to demolish the bridge and cut off the supplies of the South Russian group in Zaporizhia. Russian air defense operators claimed that they shot down the missile a few kilometers north of Russia's Taman, and that the remnants of the intercepted missile fell into the Sea of Azov. However, Russian authorities closed the bridge, causing heavy traffic jams. Representatives of the local government claimed that the Ukrainians used cruise missiles. Russian analysts noted that any use of cruise missiles would require Ukrainian jets to fly very close to the front line, exposing themselves to Russian air defenses. Two more attacks followed. One of the attacks was on Russian military installations in Russia's Rostov Oblast, and one on Bryansk Oblast. Here, the Russian air defense failed to shoot down the missile. That's why local security cameras recorded the rocket's arrival. Images were quickly analyzed. Almost all analysts agreed that Ukrainian forces are using modified S-200 rockets that follow a ballistic trajectory. That is why such rockets have a range of up to 400 kilometers. Interestingly, simultaneously with the attack on the Crimean bridge, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine officially confirmed that they were responsible for the destruction of the Crimean bridge last year. The combination of such news has caused some analysts to raise the alarm that the Ukrainians are determined to demolish the bridge in the near future and call for the region to be strengthened with even more air defense systems. The Russian Ministry of Defense should also make an official statement. Today, some media sources reported that Putin dismissed Chief of Staff Gerasimov from the post of commander of the so-called Special Military Operation. Gerasimov must remain officially Chief of Staff so as not to lose his credibility. But the new commander should be the commander of the Air Force, Colonel General Teplitsky. The changes have not yet been approved by the Russian authorities. But even if Wagner forces achieved remarkable results, such changes would be unlikely after the utterly unsuccessful winter offensive campaign. The Russian high command had an ambiguous nature from the very beginning. Meanwhile, while Ukrainian forces finally sent the Azov regiment commanders back to Ukraine, these commanders were responsible for holding Mariupol for more than 2 months at the start of the invasion, which required the Russians to leave tens of thousands of troops, giving the Ukrainians time to form a defensive line. The Azov regiment was recognized as the most elite Ukrainian detachment with extremely high standards of physical readiness and years of combat experience. The commanders stated that they would continue to fight by rejoining the army, and there is no doubt that these commanders will cause great harm to the Russian forces with the ongoing counterattack operation. Regarding the Ukrainian Air Force, 10 helicopters are about to receive. The Mi-24 helicopters have already been spotted on the road in Poland and will be featured very soon. Currently, Ukrainian forces are using these helicopters extensively in the Kherson region to protect the Ukrainian bridgehead on the other side of the river and to facilitate offensive operations against Stoleshki. Additionally, to help the Ukrainians advance faster in their counterattack, the U.S. announced new weapons deliveries, this time including cluster munitions. According to U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, 155mm artillery shells will be housed inside and accompany a staggering $800 million in additional weapons in the latest aid package aimed at supporting Kyiv's counterattack. Fragmentation. Ammunition is a special projectile that disperses explosives that cover a large area. Currently, Ukrainians face numerous Russian positions and fortifications on the fields. This means that the delivery of such weapons will greatly help the Ukrainians to carry out offensive operations faster and with fewer casualties. As a result, as Kyiv's counter-offensive continues, Ukrainian forces will continue to return to their stockpiles delivered by the US and NATO allies. Hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens are being deported. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has activated the Russian security forces and the army to ensure border security. Vladimir Putin's claims that he will declare mobilization again have created a big agenda in Russia. The state leaders of Georgia and Kazakhstan have started deporting Russian citizens living in their countries while the war between Russia and Ukraine was going on intensively. The fact that the course of the war suddenly turned in favor of Ukraine caused a major crisis in the Kremlin palace. The attempted coup of Yevgeny Prigozhin, known as a close friend of Russian leader Vladimir Putin, gave Ukraine a big trump card. The beginning of the withdrawal of Wagner soldiers from Ukraine who have supported the Russian army's occupation of Ukrainian territory since the beginning of the war has reduced the Russian army to a powerless situation. Although Wagner commander Prigozhin put an end to the coup attempt, Wagner soldiers fighting on Ukrainian territory began to leave Ukraine by terminating their contracts. It is said that about 20,000 Wagner soldiers have left Ukraine in the last week alone. The situation is not good at all in the cities of Soldau and Bakhmut, where Wagner soldiers are heavily located. According to information obtained from regional sources, the number of Wagner soldiers here has fallen by half. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, began to significantly increase its attacks on Bakhmut to turn the situation into an opportunity. For this reason, 2 different operations were carried out against Russian forces in Bakhmut in the last 2 days alone. The fact that Wagner troops have begun to withdraw from Ukrainian territory is a big problem for Putin, but Putin seems to be having his better days. The news that really shocked Vladimir Putin came from the governments of Georgia and Kazakhstan after the statements of the government of Georgia and Kazakhstan. A nightmarish life began for Vladimir Putin. On the one hand, citizens living within the borders of Russia are trying to flee abroad, while on the other hand, Russian citizens living in Kazakhstan and Georgia have begun to be sent back within the borders of Russia. As the Wagner soldiers who fought for Putin on Ukrainian territory began to leave Ukrainian territory, claims that Putin would declare mobilization again began to come up. Former Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, known as a close friend of Vladimir Putin, missed the announcement of a new mobilization in his press speech. Medvedev, who recently expressed that they will include new soldiers in the army, expressed great fear of the Russian people when he stated that they have already started working with the previous partial mobilization decision. About 300,000 Russian citizens were recruited into the army and forcibly sent to fight on Ukrainian soil. After Putin's decision to partially mobilize, hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens sought ways to leave the country. A huge influx of migration has begun to countries neighboring Russia. Russian citizens who started to flee to countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Turkey did not want to be sent to the territory of Ukraine. Tens of thousands of Russian citizens began to leave the country again when it was learned that Vladimir Putin would announce mobilization again with a decrease in the number of Russian soldiers fighting on Ukrainian territory. However, the most interesting event was that Russian citizens living in Kazakhstan and Georgia also began to be repatriated within the borders of Russia. As is known, there has been a decadent tension between Kazakhstan and Russia for months. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has spoken very harshly against Kazakh President November Tokayev after it was learned that Kazakhstan was secretly providing military equipment support to Ukraine. Vladimir Putin threatened the government of Kazakhstan, saying that if Kazakhstan continues to support Ukraine, it will ensure the closure of energy factories that Russian businessmen have established within the borders of Kazakhstan. Such a move by Putin would be a major blow to the Kazakh economy because almost 60% of the energy companies operating in Kazakhstan are owned by Russian billionaires. Kazakhstan, which is connected to Soviet Russia, had drawn its own territorial borders by declaring independence many years ago. Kazakh President November Tokayev reacted very sharply to these threats from Vladimir Putin. Tokayev, who expressed that Kazakhstan is an independent state in its own right, stated that Russia does not have any authority over Kazakhstan. Speaking very calmly, Tokayev's last sentence managed to shock the whole world. He expressed that Russian citizens living within the borders of Kazakhstan will begin to be deported, and they will do everything possible for Russian citizens to return home. While no one expected such a move from Tokayev, his words managed to surprise everyone. Thus, it was decided to expel all Russian citizens who have settled within the borders of Kazakhstan in the last 2 years, according to the statements of Kazakh government officials. Over 60,000 Russian citizens have entered the borders of Kazakhstan in the last 2 years. Thus, all of these citizens will be returned to Russia. President Tokayev immediately began deporting Russian citizens. Kazakh security forces have been activated to intervene against Russian citizens who have not left the country and will cause difficulties. When you look at the border cities of Kazakhstan and Russia right now, you can see queues that are miles long. Tens of thousands of Russian citizens continue to be deported. Another news came from the Georgian government. Georgian President Salome Zurabishvili has not decided to expel Russian citizens, but has begun to implement very strict procedures with the news that Vladimir Putin will declare mobilization again. Tens of thousands of Russian citizens are looking for ways to flee the country due to the fact that Georgia is a neighboring country with Russia. These citizens who want to escape from Russia are heading to Georgia. However, Georgian President Salome Zurabishvili stated in a statement that not even a single Russian citizen can enter the borders of Georgia as it is known. There was a war between Russia and Georgia in 2008, and there has been great tension between these two countries since then with the partial mobilization decision taken by Vladimir Putin months ago. Thousands of Russian citizens had entered the borders of Georgia. Georgian government officials took some of these Russian citizens into the country, while others were kept waiting at airports in border areas. Now, tens of thousands of Russian citizens have started waiting at the Georgian border crossing in the same way again. However, according to the statements of Georgian officials, Georgia's doors will not be open to Russian citizens this time. Russian citizens living in Kazakhstan are being sent back to Russia's borders, while citizens living in Russia are looking for ways to flee the country. Russian citizens who are in good financial condition are decanting private jets among themselves and fleeing to countries that do not want visas. The fact that Kazakhstan has started deporting Russian citizens has greatly damaged the reputation of Vladimir Putin and Russia. Although Vladimir Putin has been disgraced to the whole world, on the one hand, this is a great opportunity for Putin because the vast majority of Russian citizens deported from Kazakhstan consist of citizens who fled from the partial mobilization decision and went to Kazakhstan. Now that these citizens have returned, Vladimir Putin would be able to get more Russian soldiers with the decision to mobilize, which he will announce again. Aware of this, Vladimir Putin addressed Russian citizens living in Kazakhstan and called for them to return to their country. The first thing Vladimir Putin did was to send Russian soldiers to the border crossings of Kazakhstan. At first, it was thought that these soldiers were sent to ensure the safety of Russian citizens from Kazakhstan, but the situation was much different. Vladimir Putin has collected the identity information of all Russian citizens entering the borders of Russia. These citizens who left the country by fleeing from the previous partial mobilization decision will be the first names to be included in the army in the mobilization decision to be announced in the future. Putin is almost punishing his own citizens with this act. However, nothing can be done for these people because the government of Kazakhstan has taken the decision to deport them. On the other hand, it is in Putin's interest for Georgia to close its border crossings with Russia. Although the Georgian government has taken this decision for the sake of its own country, the fact that the Russian people cannot leave the country is to Putin's advantage. According to the reports made by Russian news agencies, Russian citizens who were sent back to the borders of Russia began to leave the country again without wasting any time. A large influx of migrants has already begun to Finland, which is located on the border with Russia. Right-wing Prime Minister Petteri Orpo took the seat instead of Sanna Marin, who lost the election along with the prime ministerial elections held in Finland. Finland's new Prime Minister, Petteri Orpo, has announced that they will make a big change in the visa rates issued to Russian citizens. The Finnish government had previously reduced the rate of visas issued to Russia. With the decision taken now, only 1 in 10 Russian citizens will be granted a visa. Thus, we can say that it has become impossible for Russian citizens to flee within the borders of Finland. The beginning of the deportation of Russian citizens living within the borders of Kazakhstan has brought a very diabolical plan to the mind of Vladimir Putin. Russian leader Vladimir Putin was aware that if Russian citizens who have fled to other foreign states are also deported, the vast majority of their citizens who have fled Russia will have to return. and that meant more troops for Vladimir Putin and the Russian military. The Russian leader does not hesitate to use all the means at his disposal for the ongoing occupation on the territory of Ukraine. Putin, who made a speech on this issue, addressed Russian citizens who have defected abroad and called for their return to their country. However, the most interesting event is that Vladimir Putin addressed foreign state leaders and demanded the deportation of Russian citizens living in their country. In other words, Putin wants Russian citizens who have started living in foreign countries with an asylum application in the last year to be deported and sent back to Russia. No one would have thought that Putin would make such a plan to get more soldiers into the army. Russian leader Vladimir Putin became much more paranoid after the coup attempt of Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin. Having lost the support of Wagner soldiers, Putin is aware that he will begin to lose the war on Ukrainian territory. For this reason, he is making a plan to find more soldiers for the army by putting all the possibilities at his disposal into action. However, Putin has started to make worse of the mistakes made in the earlier partial mobilization decision. Although many war analysts and expert researchers expressed that Vladimir Putin's mobilization decision was carried out in the wrong way, Putin again did what he knew. At the same time, Russian opposition officials have warned Putin about this on numerous occasions. Putin first forcibly recruited about 300,000 Russian citizens into the army. Then he put these Russian citizens through a very short-term training and immediately sent them to fight on Ukrainian soil. When these novice Russian soldiers began to be sent to fight on Ukrainian soil, the number of soldiers lost by the Russian army on Ukrainian territory began to increase very quickly because these new recruits, despite having no experience of war, were sent into the war within a month. But Vladimir Putin is not the only person responsible for this situation. Currently, Russian troop commanders sent to Ukraine by Valery Gerasimov, who both leads the army and is the chief of the Russian General Staff, are making these novice Russian soldiers fight on the very front lines of the front, despite the fact that these soldiers have no combat experience.